The night was colder than usual. It crept through the streets of Würzburg like smoke, slipping into houses, between the cracks of shutters, beneath the blankets of children. It was the year 1626, and fear itself had become a language that everyone understood. In a quiet village square, a single torch burned in the darkness, casting a flickering orange light over faces that whispered and eyes that would not meet one another. A woman had been accused of witchcraft. No proof, no trial, just a whisper and a name. What began as superstition was about to ignite into a continental panic. The idea of witches did not appear suddenly. It had been brewing for centuries, in the sermons of priests, in the margins of dusty manuscripts, and in the fearful imagination of a Europe that could not explain the world it lived in. Disease, famine, stillbirths, spoiled harvests, every tragedy needed a villain. And when no explanation could be found, one was created. In medieval villages, it was believed that witches consorted with the devil, cursed their neighbors, and danced in the woods at night. At first, these stories were little more than folk tales, things told to keep children from wandering after dark. But slowly, these whispers evolved into accusations, and accusations became weapons. During this period, Europe was a land trembling under the weight of war, plague, and religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation had torn apart the Church's unity, splitting communities and faiths in two. The 30 Years' War raged across the continent, leaving famine and fear in its wake. And in that fear, something poisonous began to grow. Across villages in Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, and France, priests began to preach about Satan walking among them, not as a horned beast, but through ordinary people. A neighbor, a midwife, a widow, a woman who walked alone. It was during this time that a book fell into eager hands, a book that would pour oil on a fire already burning. Malleus Maleficarium, The Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, spread like wildfire across Europe. It was a manual for witch hunting, how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to force confessions, and how to save their souls through death.
This book did not remain on dusty shelves. It was read from pulpits, studied by judges, and used as justification for unimaginable cruelty. It declared that witches were real, that women were weak and easily tempted by the devil, and that any mercy shown to them would be treason against God. The line between faith and fear began to blur, and then it disappeared entirely. At first, accusations came from neighbors. A cow fell ill. Someone pointed to the woman down the road. A baby died in the night. Someone remembered seeing an old widow near the house. Bread turned black in the oven. Clearly the work of the devil. And when fear grows, logic dies. In some towns, entire families were torn apart by a single accusation. The word witch spread like a disease, and no one could cure it. Not even the church wanted to stop it. In many cases, they encouraged it. It was not enough to believe in God. You had to prove your loyalty by identifying his enemies. As the witch panic spread, cities began building the first witch prisons, fortified stone dungeons specifically designed to hold the accused. These were not ordinary jails. They were machines of fear. In Bamberg, an entire section of the prison was reserved for witches. In Edinburgh, holding cells beneath the castle became known for their screams at night. In Trier, Hundreds of people would pass through its gates, and few would ever walk out. The accused were locked in darkness, awaiting trials that were little more than rituals of guilt. And outside, the flames of hysteria grew taller. The witch hunts were not just born from fear, they were born from power. When a woman was accused, her land could be seized, her belongings distributed, her children orphaned. Those who accused were often rewarded, whether in coin, property, or favor with the church.
And so, a system was born. A system where fear was currency, where silence was survival, and where every accusation fed the machine. By the early 17th century, entire towns were transformed into hunting grounds. Between 1560 and 1660 alone, more than 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Most of them were women. Many of them were midwives, healers, widows, people who simply stood outside the bounds of what society called normal. And it was only the beginning. In villages across Germany, children learned to keep their eyes down. A wrong word could make their mother disappear. In France, neighbors stopped talking to one another at night. In Scotland, women stopped gathering herbs for medicine because a healer was often the first to hang. Fear had entered every home, and soon the inquisitors would follow. They came with black robes, holy seals, and a chilling certainty. They claimed to defend God's will, but what they truly brought was hell. The birth of the witch panic was not a single spark. It was 1,000 small flames, whispers, books, sermons, greed, superstition, all feeding into a fire that would consume Europe for nearly 2 centuries. Before it was over, thousands would confess to crimes they never committed. Hundreds of towns would be stained with blood, and the world would discover how easily faith can be twisted into a weapon. In the beginning, they said they were protecting the innocent, but in the end, no one was innocent enough to be safe. The village of Trier lay still in the mist of an early winter morning. A frost coated the rooftops, and the river whispered like a ghost beneath its frozen skin. But the silence didn't mean peace. It meant something far worse. It meant they had come.
Down the road, black horses pulled a heavy wooden wagon, its iron wheels groaning under the weight of its passengers. Men in long black robes sat inside, their faces half hidden beneath wide hats. On the doors of the wagon, the church's seal glimmered faintly in the pale light. They were the inquisitors, and wherever they arrived, fear followed. The villagers gathered at a distance, watching in silence as the men descended. They were not like priests. Their voices were low, their steps measured, their faces unreadable. They carried not Bibles in their hands, but warrants. And behind their polite smiles was the authority to arrest, to interrogate, and to kill, all in the name of God. These were men forged by the church during a time when the boundaries between religion and law no longer existed. Their power was absolute. A whisper in their ear could condemn a life. A signature on their paper could burn a soul. The inquisitors did not roam randomly. They targeted villages carefully, places where rumors already festered, where people were frightened, where faith and fear blurred together. They arrived with a familiar story. The devil is among you.
They spoke of witch covens, Satan's pacts, and hellish conspiracies hidden behind everyday smiles. And in terrified communities, communities battered by famine, war, and disease, these words were not questioned, they were believed. The inquisitors brought with them notebooks filled with the names of the accused. Sometimes those names came from neighboring towns. Other times, they came from someone inside the village. A neighbor, a rival, a frightened soul who believed that accusing another might spare themselves. Once in town, the inquisitors summoned the priests and local leaders. The church's village became their headquarters, the altar their judgment hall. The crucifix above the pews became a silent witness to the horrors that followed.
At night, they would walk through the village in silence, like black shadows gliding past windows. And when they knocked on a door, someone always disappeared. The inquisitors had their own language, legal words wrapped in holy scripture. "We are here to purify the land, to save the souls of the corrupted, to protect you from the devil's servants." But everyone understood the truth beneath the scripture. This was not about mercy. This was about control. Their power came not only from fear, but from the church itself. During the height of the witch panic, the Catholic Church issued letters and bulls that gave inquisitors extraordinary authority. They could bypass local laws. They could arrest anyone at any hour. They could seize property, and their word could not be challenged. In places like Bamberg and Würzburg, inquisitors turned entire cities into theaters of terror. In Scotland, they cooperated with local kirk sessions to hunt devil's agents. Even in France, where secular courts sometimes clashed with the church, their influence could turn an ordinary trial into a death sentence. They were not alone. With them came scribes to record confessions, guards to escort the accused, and priests to deliver last rites. A single arrival of an inquisitorial team could turn a peaceful town into a graveyard in less than a month. The first arrests were usually symbolic: a midwife, a widow, a healer, or someone poor and isolated. The message was clear. If even they can fall, so can anyone. And then the floodgates opened. The arrests always began at night. Horses moved quietly through muddy streets. Torches flickered under the moon. Heavy fists pounded on wooden doors. Inside, families awoke in terror. Mothers were dragged from their beds. Children screamed. Men begged. But no one begged louder than the ones who watched, because they knew to speak out was to join the accused. Once taken, the prisoners vanished into the witch prisons, dark stone cells beneath churches, castles, or city towers. They were stripped of their names and given numbers or titles like the accused. Interrogations rarely began immediately. The inquisitors understood something cruel. Fear is sharper when it is allowed to ripen in silence. But the power of the inquisitors did not rest only in terror. It rested in faith. People genuinely believed these men were fighting Satan himself. To doubt them was to doubt God. And in a world where heresy meant death, no one dared to doubt. Even the accused sometimes believed they were guilty, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the entire world told them so. Every glance, every whisper, every sermon turned them into monsters in their own minds. This was the genius and horror of the Inquisition. They did not need to prove a witch existed. They only needed to convince others that evil was real and near, and the rest would follow willingly. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Children accused their parents. Priests stood silent as parishioners were dragged away. Because once the black robes arrived, the line between sinner and saint vanished. It was not uncommon for entire towns to welcome the inquisitors, believing their presence would cleanse the land of darkness. But they soon learned the truth. Once the Inquisition began its work, it never left without leaving ashes behind. The arrival of the Inquisitors marked a turning point in Europe's witch panic. Before them, accusations were local, chaotic, often personal. But now, they were systematic, organized, blessed by the Church. Their network stretched across borders. Their records kept names, confessions, signatures, dates. They built a machine that would last for centuries, powered by fear, faith, and fire. The people did not yet know what awaited them inside those prisons. They did not know the sounds their village would soon hear at night, the cries, the chains, the prayers that never reached heaven. But they would learn soon, because the Inquisitors had arrived, and they were just beginning. They said they served God, but when the black robes came, even God felt far away.
It didn't take much to destroy a life. A glance at the wrong time, a word spoken in fear, a neighbor's whisper in the dark. In an age where superstition ruled stronger than law, accusation became a weapon more deadly than any sword. And in the witch panic of early modern Europe, anyone could wield it. It often began in the smallest of ways. A cow that stopped giving milk, a child who fell ill overnight, bread that failed to rise, rain that refused to come. In a world without science, the unexplained was always the devil's work. And where the devil was said to be, a witch was never far behind. People believed witches were not strangers. They were neighbors, women at the market, healers who brewed herbs, widows who lived at the edge of town, the person next door, the one who was different. The Inquisitors didn't need to search for witches themselves. The people did it for them. At Sunday Mass, priests spoke of the devil's army hiding in plain sight. They described witches as smiling faces concealing blackened souls. And when villagers left the church, they looked at one another differently. Every glance, every small gesture, suddenly dangerous. Suspicion turned into a silent game of survival. The perfect target was almost always someone on the margins. A woman who spoke too loudly, a healer who knew too much, a widow without a husband to defend her, a midwife whose hands had touched both life and death. But it wasn't only women. Men, too, were accused, especially those who stood against the church, practiced folk traditions, or simply annoyed the wrong person at the wrong time. Sometimes the accusations were born from jealousy. A farmer loses a crop. His neighbor's harvest thrives. Jealousy becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes accusation. Other times it was revenge, a debt unpaid, a love triangle, a bitter argument in the market square. And sometimes, the cruelest of all, accusations came from fear itself. A child sees something they don't understand. A priest whispers about the devil's signs, and the child repeats it, not knowing they have just sentenced someone to death. Once a name was spoken, there was no going back. The Inquisitors recorded it in their ledgers, marking it with a black cross. The accused would be taken, questioned, and most likely condemned. But the danger didn't stop there. When one name was spoken, others soon followed. Because under torture or fear, people accused others to save themselves. Survival became betrayal. In many witch trials, the accused were forced to name their accomplices. And even those who resisted eventually broke. Not because they were guilty, but because no one could resist endless pain. A single whisper could become an avalanche. One accusation would turn into 5. 5 would turn into 20. Entire villages could be swallowed whole. In Bamberg, a miller once accused his neighbor after a bad harvest. The neighbor named a midwife. The midwife, under torture, named a dozen others. Within 3 months, the town executed over 300 people. In Scotland, a young girl accused a woman of sending spirits to torment her at night. The woman denied it, but the child's tears were enough. She was hanged the next morning. In Trier, a single accusation in 1587 started a chain reaction so brutal that more than 350 people, from bakers to priests to children, were executed as witches. The Inquisitors encouraged this cycle. They believed the devil worked in circles. A witch never acted alone. So every confession had to lead to more names. The interrogators would lean close to the accused. Tell us who you met with in the woods. Tell us who flew with you at night. Name the others, and God may forgive your soul. Under agony, the mind fractures. Memory becomes a blur.
And so names are spoken, not in guilt, in terror. But what made this system unstoppable was not just the torture, it was the silence of the crowd. Most people didn't believe their neighbors were witches, at least not at first. But to speak out against an accusation was to become the next one. And so they turned away. They shut their doors. They whispered prayers and hoped the black robes would pass their homes. Fear made everyone a participant, even the innocent. The accused didn't have lawyers. They didn't have rights. An accusation was proof enough. In many towns, the moment someone was named, their fate was sealed. This was the cruelest truth of all. It didn't matter if you were guilty. What mattered was that someone said you were. Some people tried to flee when their names were whispered. But flight was considered proof of guilt. Others tried to beg the inquisitors for mercy. But mercy had no place in the witch prisons. There were no second chances. There were no appeals. Only the dungeon and the fire. One of the most terrifying aspects of the accusation system was how it targeted women, in particular. Inquisitors believed women were weaker, more emotional, and more easily tempted by the devil. The Malleus Maleficarum declared that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. And with that single sentence, millions of lives were placed beneath the blade of suspicion. Midwives, healers, widows, pillars of their communities were suddenly painted as Satan's brides. And their neighbors, paralyzed by fear, watched them vanish. In a single night, a whole town could shift. One whisper at the well, one glance in the market, and suddenly, everything you were, mother, friend, neighbor, meant nothing. You were a witch. And once the word witch was spoken, no one heard anything else. The witch panic was never truly about witchcraft. It was about fear. Fear weaponized. Fear sharpened. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor until no one knew who to trust. And that fear would soon feed the prisons, where the accused were dragged in chains. They called it justice, but in truth, it was just a whisper turned into fire. The accusation game was the heartbeat of the witch hunts. Silent, invisible, unstoppable. And the inquisitors, with their ledgers and crosses, were only too eager to listen.
The hour of fear was never noon. It came when the world slept, when the only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the creak of the gallows in the square. It was at night that the inquisitors came for their prey. No trial, no warning, only a pounding on the door, and then the world changed forever. In towns across Germany, France, and Scotland, midnight became a sound that people feared. Horses, torches, boots on frozen ground, whispers in Latin. The inquisitors chose the night for a reason. Darkness stripped people of courage. It turned every home into a cage. And when they came in black robes, there was no one to intervene. No crowds, no protest, only silence. The arrests were fast, brutal. Men in hoods forced open doors with iron bars. Families jolted awake by the thunder of boots. Mothers clutching their children, fathers raising hands that were quickly struck down. The accused, often women, were dragged from their beds in their nightclothes. No shoes, no time to speak, no time to even understand what was happening. For many, it was the last time they ever saw their homes. The inquisitors never came alone. They brought guards and scribes, and sometimes even the town priest, to give the illusion of holiness to what was about to happen. In the name of God, you are accused of witchcraft, they would declare. Come quietly, and your soul may yet be saved. But mercy was never part of their mission. Hands were tied, feet were bound, some were gagged. Those who resisted were beaten until they fell silent. Outside, wagons waited, dark, wooden, cold. They were called devil's carts by the villagers, because when someone entered those wagons, they almost never came back. For the neighbors watching from the shadows, this was a warning. Curtains fluttered, eyes peeked through cracks in shutters. But no one opened their doors. To speak out was to join the accused. And so the village watched in silence as their neighbors were stolen away. Inside the wagons, the prisoners sat in darkness. Some whispered prayers, some sobbed quietly, some stared blankly at the walls, knowing what awaited them. The roads to the witch prisons were long and cold. Every turn of the wheels echoed like a funeral drum. For many, it truly was. The inquisitors did not arrest one person at a time. They moved like a storm. In some villages, a dozen people could vanish in a single night. Entire families could be taken, accused of conspiring with the devil. In Bamberg in 1628, inquisitors arrested 300 people in less than a month. In Trier, one village lost almost half its population. And in Edinburgh, night raids became so common that people stopped sleeping indoors, hoping the forests might protect them. But nowhere was safe. The accused were taken to holding cells first, temporary prisons where they were sorted, questioned, and prepared for the real dungeons. Here, names were written in the inquisitors' ledgers, along with their supposed crimes. Communed with the devil, flew with witches in the night, cursed a neighbor's harvest, made pacts with demons. These were not crimes based on truth. They were stories. Stories written in ink enforced with iron. The inquisitors didn't need to prove anything. The accusation alone was enough to hold someone. And so, while the accused shivered in the dark, the inquisitors feasted upstairs. Their job was not justice. Their job was to feed the fire. But the greatest cruelty of the night arrests was the silence they left behind. When dawn broke, families woke to empty beds. Neighbors walked past abandoned homes. Markets opened, but no one spoke.
People began to mark their doors with crosses, believing it would protect them. Others slept in barns or fields, too afraid to stay in their homes. But it didn't matter. The black robes always found their way. There was no age limit for accusation. The inquisitors took grandmothers, daughters, even children. In Würzburg, entire families, from elders to infants, were burned together after being accused of witchcraft. They believed that the devil infects bloodlines, and so one accusation could destroy generations. Those left behind faced their own torment. If your mother was taken, you became suspect. If your neighbor was taken, your silence was guilt. Even mourning the accused was considered dangerous. In a single night, community bonds were shattered. Friends became strangers. Families dissolved into fear. And then came the final step, the branding of the accused. Once inside the witch prisons, names were erased. They became numbers. Records marked with black crosses, their fates already decided. She is suspected of dancing with the devil. He is accused of bewitching livestock. She spoke to the moon. To us today it sounds like madness. To them, it was law. Inquisitors often claimed they gave the accused a chance to confess and save their souls, but what they really offered was a choice between two dooms: torture until confession, or torture anyway. The night raids were only the beginning. The darkness outside was nothing compared to what awaited in the cells below the earth. The black wagons would vanish into the dawn, and the world would go on as if nothing had happened. Markets would open, bells would ring, children would play. But everyone would walk with their heads down, because they knew the next knock could be for them. No one slept in peace once the wagons came, because in the time of witch prisons, innocence was not protection, it was a countdown.
Beneath the streets of Europe's great cities, below the churches, the castles, the cobblestone squares, there were places where the sun never touched, cold, airless, and black as the grave. They were called witch prisons, but they were not meant to hold the guilty. They were built to break the living. When the inquisitors dragged their prisoners through the iron gates, they were not entering a court of law. They were descending into a machine of fear, one carefully designed to crush the mind, weaken the body, and bleed confessions from anyone who passed through. The first thing the accused noticed was the smell. It was everywhere. Rotting straw, human waste, sweat, blood. The scent clung to the air like a ghost, choking every breath. Some prisons were beneath old monasteries, others inside castle basements. But they were all the same: stone corridors, wet with dripping water, narrow cells no bigger than a closet. And in each cell, someone waited in silence. The prisoners were stripped of everything: names, clothes, dignity. They were given thin, lice-infested rags and chained to the wall or floor. The shackles were deliberately too tight, biting into their skin, cutting off circulation. Some chains were so short prisoners could neither stand nor lie flat. Day and night blurred together in the darkness. There was no clock, no window, no sky. Only the drip of water and the soft scrape of rats in the straw. In Bamberg, the witch prison was a series of underground vaults beneath the bishop's palace. Hundreds of men, women, and children passed through its gates during the early 1600s. Few came out alive. In Würzburg, inquisitors kept a register of the dead, long lists of names scratched into paper. Margarita, age 12. Johann, age 70. Anna, age 45. None of them ever faced a real trial. And in Trier, prisoners were so crowded into cells that many suffocated before interrogation ever began.
The witch prisons were designed not just to hold people, but to unmake them. The darkness was constant. Prisoners lost track of time, hours, days, weeks blending together like ink in water. Many went mad long before the torture began. Starvation was routine. Meals, when given, were nothing more than stale bread and water, sometimes not even that. Many accused witches died before they ever confessed, their names quietly crossed off the ledger as delivered to God. The inquisitors understood something terrifying. You don't need flames to break someone. You just need silence. And the silence inside those prisons was not natural. It was manufactured. No voices, no songs, no light. Just the slow drip of water, the shuffle of boots, and the screams from deeper rooms, screams everyone could hear, but no one could escape. In Edinburgh, beneath the castle, a series of witch vaults held prisoners so tightly packed that they were forced to sleep sitting up, their backs against damp stone. In France, some prisons had isolation pits, holes barely wide enough for a human body, where accused witches were lowered and forgotten. And in Germany, some cells were kept deliberately close to torture rooms, so that every prisoner heard what awaited them. One of the cruelest aspects of witch prisons was how communal suffering turned into another form of control. The prisoners could hear each other, but not speak freely. Any whisper, any attempt at comfort could be used against them. Inquisitors often walked the halls silently at night, listening through cracks and holes. If they heard names, those names were added to their lists. Even hope became a danger. The air in these prisons was thick with more than damp and rot. It was thick with fear. People had entered those cells as mothers, fathers, healers, neighbors. But after weeks or months underground, they forgot their own reflections. And this was by design. When they were finally dragged into interrogation rooms, their minds were already broken. Confession for many was not an act of guilt. It was a desperate plea for the nightmare to end. But the suffering did not belong only to adults. Children, too, were thrown into these dungeons. Some were accused themselves, others were taken to pressure their parents to confessing. A child's cry in the dark was a weapon, sharpened by the inquisitors. The witch prisons also became breeding grounds for disease. With no sanitation and little food, prisoners quickly grew sick. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, these killed many long before a trial ever took place. And yet inquisitors didn't care. If she dies, it is God's judgment, they would say. If she lives, she will confess. To them, death was not tragedy, it was confirmation.
Some prisoners were marked for special treatment. Their names were whispered more often in the town square. They were midwives, healers, or people who had defied the church before. For these souls, the prison was not a holding cell. It was a waiting room for the pyre. But the vast majority were ordinary people, caught in a storm they didn't understand. Their only crime was being named. Inquisitors often visited the cells at night, holding lanterns that blinded prisoners who hadn't seen light in days. They would read accusations aloud like scripture, circling their prey like vultures. Some prisoners prayed, some begged, and some simply stared at the wall, their will already gone. In Würzburg, some prisoners left carvings on the walls of their cells, crosses, names, desperate messages scratched with fingernails or bits of bone. Most of these carvings have been lost to time, but a few remain. Lord, deliver me. I am innocent. Forgive them. They are the last words of people the world tried to erase. To the inquisitors, the witch prisons were a tool. To the prisoners, they were a grave dug slowly. Some prisoners begged for execution just to end the agony. Others clung to faith, whispering prayers into the darkness. But faith rarely answered back in those damp, black halls. The witch prisons were not just buildings. They were symbols, monuments to a fear so powerful it could turn entire nations against their own people. They called it justice, but these were not prisons of law. They were tombs for the living.
The witch prisons were built to break the body slowly, but the interrogation chambers were built to break the soul. For the inquisitors, torture was not a crime, it was a ritual, a sacred duty wrapped in scripture and law. They did not whisper justice, they whispered salvation. But salvation came with pain. The accused were not led to these rooms gently. 2 guards would drag them down stone steps, slick with moisture, their bare feet scraping against the ground. Lanterns swung above, casting shadows that looked almost alive on the walls. For many, the walk to the chamber was worse than the pain itself, because everyone in the prison had heard the screams before. They knew what waited on the other side of that door. The torture chambers were usually small, a single table, racks of iron tools, hooks on the walls, and in the center, the inquisitor's chair. No judge, no jury, only men in robes and their instruments of truth. The church called it examination, but it was nothing less than state-sanctioned brutality. And it followed a cold, deliberate process. First came the prayer. A priest would recite holy verses, blessing the room as if what was about to happen were an act of mercy. Then came the questions. Do you confess to consorting with the devil? Who flew with you at night? Who else danced in the forest? If the prisoner said no, the inquisitor would nod quietly and give the signal. The pain would begin.
The strappado was one of their favorite tools. The prisoners' arms were tied behind their back, and a rope was attached to their wrists. Then they were lifted slowly into the air, dislocating shoulders, tearing ligaments, leaving nothing but agony. Sometimes they were dropped suddenly, not enough to kill, just enough to shatter something inside. Screams echoed off the stone walls, prayers turned into pleas, and the inquisitors waited, patient as executioners.
If the strappado didn't work, there was the rack. A simple wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The prisoner's wrists were tied to one side, their ankles to the other. Then the rollers turned, and the human body, a fragile machine of joints and tendons, was stretched until something gave. The inquisitors believed that truth lived inside the pain, that a scream was not a cry of suffering, but the devil leaving the body. In Würzburg, inquisitors recorded with chilling precision how many turns it took to make a prisoner speak. In Bamberg, some victims were stretched until their bones cracked audibly in the night. In Trier, they combined torture with prayers, a twisted chorus of agony and scripture. "Tell us the truth," they said, "and God will forgive you." But the truth they wanted was not the truth. It was a confession. Another device was the thumbscrew, small, simple, cruel. Metal clamps crushed the fingers, one joint at a time. The pain was excruciating, precise, intimate, and it left no chance of resistance. Some victims fainted. Others screamed until their voices were nothing but hoarse gasps. And when they could no longer scream, the inquisitors simply tightened the screws again. There was also water. Not the clean kind, but the drowning test in disguise. Waterboarding, centuries before it had a name. The prisoner was tied to a table, a cloth placed over their face, and water poured over their nose and mouth until they choked. The inquisitors called it interviewing the soul. If the prisoner begged for mercy, it was considered proof of guilt. If they remained silent, it was said the devil was inside them. There was no winning. The most terrifying part of these sessions wasn't always the tools. It was the ritual itself. The inquisitors acted calm, even gentle. They spoke softly. They offered prayers. They promised forgiveness if the accused just confessed. Many broke not under pain, but under the weight of false hope. Say the words, and this will end. Say the names, and God will have mercy. But the mercy they spoke of was death.
Every word uttered under torture was carefully recorded by scribes. These confessions became legal documents. Even if a prisoner later recanted, the written confession was all the court needed. Inquisitors didn't care if the confession was true. They only cared that it existed. Some people endured torture for hours, even days, without speaking. But their silence was also twisted into proof. See, the devil gives her strength. Others broke within minutes, whispering names of neighbors, friends, or strangers. Because when the body is in agony, the mind will say anything to make it stop. And that was the point. Torture was never about truth. It was about obedience. In Scotland, accused witches were tortured in damp castle vaults, their screams carried through the night air. In France, they used interrogation chairs, with spikes heated over coals. In Germany, they used masks, grotesque iron faces locked over the head, to humiliate and silence. And in every case, the inquisitors justified their cruelty with one phrase: "We are saving their souls." The prisoners who survived these sessions were unrecognizable. Shoulders dislocated, bones broken, hands mangled. But the worst wounds were invisible. Many forgot their own names. Many believed they were guilty. Because when pain is constant, reality bends. And the inquisitors knew this better than anyone. When the torture was done, the accused were dragged back to their cells, limp, bleeding, half-conscious. Some never moved again.
Others whispered prayers into the dark, waiting for the next session. In their ledgers, the inquisitors would write, "Confessed freely, the devil has been cast out." But there was nothing free about it, only terror. They said pain would bring out the truth, but pain only brought out screams, and the world believed those screams were confessions. In these rooms, faith became a weapon, mercy became a lie, and humanity was left outside the door.
The screams had faded. The irons were cooling, but the torture chambers were far from silent. Because in the world of the Inquisitors, the true weapon was not the rope or the rack. It was the confession. A single signature, scrolled by a trembling, broken hand, could destroy a life, a family, even a village. And yet, almost every word written in those ledgers was a lie whispered through pain. The church believed confession was sacred, the final proof that the devil had been defeated. But in the witch prisons, confession became ritualized theater. Every word had to follow a script. Yes, I served the devil. Yes, I flew through the night. Yes, I cursed my neighbor. Yes, I met with others. Each line rehearsed, rewritten, repeated, until the story was complete, the story the Inquisitors wanted to hear. After hours, sometimes days of torture, the prisoner would be brought before a table, her hands shaking, wrists raw from ropes, eyes hollow from exhaustion. A priest stood to one side, reading questions aloud in Latin. A scribe sat opposite, his quill poised. The inquisitor spoke softly, almost kindly. "Do you wish to confess your sins?" Most nodded, not out of guilt, but out of desperation. They had learned that silence meant more pain, and pain, by now, was a language they could no longer bear to speak. The inquisitors rarely asked for details, they fed them. Did the devil appear to you in the woods? Did he promise you power? Did you kiss him? Did you attend the Sabbath? The prisoner's answers, weak and trembling, didn't matter. Whatever they said, the scribe would write what the church wanted to see. And at the end of the interrogation, the confession would be read back aloud, their own words twisted into a death sentence. Some prisoners refused to confess even under torture, but the inquisitors had their ways. They would record partial admissions, changing "I am innocent" into "she denies only part of her crimes." Or they would write that a confession was obtained with divine assistance. Even silence could become guilt.
In Würzburg, a woman named Dorothea Flock confessed only after being tortured for 3 days. She admitted to attending a witch's Sabbath, something she'd never even heard of before. When she tried to retract her words, the church refused. "The devil makes her lie," they said. She was executed 2 days later. In Trier, a farmer confessed to flying through the air with witches. When asked how he could do so without wings, he said, "If I say I flew, you'll kill me. If I say I didn't, you'll kill me. So do what you came for." They did. Once the confession was signed, usually with a cross since most couldn't write, the process was sealed. The prisoner would be told that God had forgiven them. They would be allowed a priest for last rites, sometimes even a final meal. And then they would be led away. Not to freedom, but to the stake. What made these rituals so devastating was their illusion of holiness. The inquisitors believed they were saving souls. The church blessed their work, and the people, watching from outside, were told that confessions proved witches were real.
The more people confessed, the more everyone believed. The witch panic became self-sustaining, a fire feeding on its own smoke. In Bamberg, entire ledgers were filled with these forced confessions, each name linked to another, each story repeating the same pattern: a meeting in the woods, a pact with the devil, a curse upon a child or crop, a flight through the night sky. Thousands of people across hundreds of towns confessing to identical crimes. The Inquisitors called it evidence. Historians now call it madness written in ink. Some prisoners tried to resist even in their final moments. They spoke the truth as the Inquisitors read the lies. I never cursed anyone. I never flew. I only prayed. But the world outside never heard them. Their words were buried beneath parchment and ash. To make matters worse, these confessions didn't end with the accused. They named others, friends, neighbors, family, forced to do so under pain. Every signature was a spark that lit another fire. Every name spoken echoed into another cell. The cycle never stopped. In the eyes of the Church, each confession proved the existence of witches, which justified more arrests, more torture, and more death. It was a loop of horror. Pain created confession, confession created fear, fear created more pain. And so the wheel kept turning, but not all inquisitors were blind. Some began to notice the pattern, the absurd repetition of stories, the desperation in the accused, the guilt in their own hands. A few priests quietly destroyed confessions, smuggled out prisoners, or fled their posts entirely. But they were rare, and most of them paid for mercy with their lives.
Because questioning the system was the same as questioning God, and no one survived that. The saddest truth of all? For many prisoners, confession became a kind of salvation, not of the soul, but of the body. Because confessing often meant the torture would stop. Even if it meant death, at least the pain would end. Some whispered their false guilt like a final prayer, hoping God would understand what man refused to see. They confessed to crimes they never committed, but the only true sin in those rooms was the cruelty of those who demanded their words. The confession ritual turned lies into law, victims into villains, and execution into salvation. It was not justice. It was a script written in blood, performed again and again across Europe. By the time the witch hunts reached their height, confession was no longer enough. The Inquisitors wanted proof, something the human eye could see and the Church could sanctify as divine evidence. And so began the next chapter of horror, the search for the devil's mark. It was said that when a person made a pact with the devil, he would leave his signature somewhere on their body, a mark invisible to ordinary people, but visible to those blessed with God's light. The Inquisitors believed that finding this mark was the ultimate confirmation of guilt, and they would stop at nothing to find it. The search was called an examination, but what it truly was a violation. The accused were stripped naked, their bodies exposed to cold air and cold eyes. Teams of so-called witchfinders, often men of the Church, would circle them slowly, holding candles, knives, and long needles. Every freckle, every birthmark, every scar was suspect. To the Inquisitors, even the smallest blemish could be the devil's kiss. They said the devil's mark had no feeling, that if pricked with a needle, it would not bleed or hurt. So they began to poke and prod. One by one,
They jabbed needles into flesh, arms, shoulders, thighs. Women screamed in pain, then silence. The silence used against them as proof. "You see," the examiner would say, "she did not cry out. The mark feels no pain." Even when blood ran freely, they claimed it was a trick, the devil disguising his work. In Germany, these examinations were recorded in meticulous detail. A mark was found beneath the left shoulder. A mole behind the ear showed no pain. A small spot on the thigh did not bleed. Each line sealed a fate. Each mark became a death sentence. And because no one was without blemish, no one was truly safe. The examinations were not done privately. They were public acts of humiliation. In Scotland, women were stripped and tied before witnesses, their dignity shredded along with their clothes. In France, witch prickers, men hired to find the mark, traveled from town to town, earning silver for every witch they discovered. One of the most infamous was John Kincaid, a Scottish witch pricker known for his cold precision. He carried a hollow-tipped needle that could retract into its handle, making it look as if the accused didn't bleed when pricked. His victims, dozens. His evidence, illusion.
The hunt for the devil's mark was not just a search for physical evidence. It was a way to strip away humanity. By turning skin into proof, the inquisitors made sure that guilt could not be denied. Even the body itself betrayed the accused. The devil's mark became the ultimate lie, one that no truth could erase. In Würzburg, where entire families were accused, examiners found marks on children as well, birthmarks and bruises mistaken for Satan's seal. They believed evil could be inherited through flesh, and so the curse spread from mothers to daughters, fathers to sons, generation after generation. A child's freckle could condemn an entire household. The mark could be anywhere, under the tongue, behind the ear, between the toes, even on the genitals. The examinations became grotesque rituals, equal parts torture and desecration. The inquisitors called it holy work. The victims called it hell. Once a mark was found, the inquisitors would summon the scribes and priests. The evidence was read aloud. Witnesses signed their names, and the accused was officially branded as a witch. Even if they had confessed nothing, the mark was considered enough. "The devil's sign has been revealed," they declared. "No further proof is needed." And that was the end. But not all inquisitors believed. Some quietly questioned how a birthmark could prove anything. One German priest wrote in his journal, "If the devil marks his servants, he has marked us all." His words were never made public. He disappeared the following winter. For the prisoners, the hunt for the devil's mark was often worse than torture, because it stripped away even the illusion of control. A confession could be retracted, but a mark? A mark was part of the body. They could never wash it off, never prove it false. It was permanent guilt carved by nature itself. When the examinations ended, the accused were left shaking, bleeding, and ashamed. Their bodies, once their only refuge, had become evidence against them. They were told that their very skin served Satan, and so many began to believe it. That was the true horror. The devil's mark didn't just convict them, it converted them in their own minds. Pain and shame turned into guilt. In France and Germany, the search for marks soon expanded to entire communities. Old women with moles, farmers with scars,
children with strange birthmarks. Every mark became a story. Every story became an accusation. The Inquisitors called it the devil's signature, but history remembers it as madness given form. As the years passed, even ordinary ailments became suspect. Epilepsy, deformities, blindness, all said to be caused by Satan's touch. People began hiding their bodies, cutting off moles, burning freckles with hot irons, hoping to erase the signs before they were seen. But the more they hid, the guiltier they looked. No one could escape the eye of holy paranoia.
They searched for the devil in the skin, one survivor wrote, but the devil they feared lived in their own hearts. The search for the devil's mark revealed nothing about witches, but everything about mankind's hunger for control and our endless need to see evil where none exists. The devil's mark became more than superstition. It was a weapon of simplicity, a way to turn every imperfection into proof, every body into evidence, every human into a suspect. And once the world believed that guilt could be seen with the eyes, the burning began. By the time dawn broke over the cobblestone squares of Europe, the fires were already waiting. Timbers soaked in pitch, bundles of straw stacked high. The stakes stood like sentinels, tall, cold, and hungry. For the Inquisitors, it was justice. For the crowd, it was spectacle. For the condemned, it was the end. The witch trials had entered their most terrifying phase, the executions. From Germany to France, Scotland to Switzerland, the process was always the same. The accused were dragged from their cells, barely alive from torture. Their confessions, forced, written, and signed, were read aloud in the square. And as the people gathered, the Inquisitors reminded them, this is not vengeance, this is salvation. But salvation, that day, looked like fire. The executions were public for a reason. They were designed to teach obedience, to remind every villager, farmer, and child what happened to those who questioned the church's power. The sight of flames wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. And so they came, men, women, and children. They filled the square, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers, and pretending not to tremble. They came to see evil destroyed, not realizing that evil was the one holding the torch.
The condemned were bound tightly to the stake, sometimes with chains, sometimes with iron collars that dug into the throat. A priest would step forward, holding a crucifix to their face. "Repent, and your soul shall be saved." But most had already repented, again and again, under pain. Their sin wasn't disbelief. Their sin was being chosen as an example. In Bamberg, executions were held in the town square. Sometimes 20 or 30 people burned in a single morning. Witnesses described the smoke darkening the sky for hours. The flames carried the smell of pitch, hair, and flesh. The smell of faith turned to ash. In Würzburg, nearly 900 souls were executed in less than 2 years. Among them were nobles, priests, children as young as 10. The Inquisitors wrote in their journals, "The work of God continues." But no God ever asked for this. Before the flames were lit, each condemned was given a chance to speak. Some begged for mercy. Some called for their families. Some, broken beyond words, simply stared at the crowd. And some, the strongest, spoke the truth. "I am innocent. You burn me for your lies."
but their words were drowned by the roar of the crowd and the crackle of wood catching flame. The inquisitors called these deaths purifications. They said the fire burned away sin, freeing the soul from Satan's grasp. To the church, the victims were martyrs of repentance. To the people, they were monsters being destroyed. But to history, they were innocents murdered by fear. The flames rose higher. Bodies writhed, then fell still. The ropes burned through. Ash drifted like black snow, and yet the priests kept chanting, their words smothered by fire, their eyes reflecting the inferno they called holy. The crowd crossed themselves. Some wept, some cheered, and some turned away in silence, knowing that next time it could be them. Every execution was recorded. Names, crimes, confessions, and results. The ledgers were signed by priests, judges, and witnesses. Each entry ended with a phrase, "Executed in the light of God." These books still exist, pages of ash-bound history, each word a tombstone for someone who never had a chance to speak for themselves. When the fires cooled, ashes were swept away, sometimes scattered in rivers, sometimes buried outside city walls. Because even in death, the witches were denied rest. The church feared their remains might curse the living, and so they were erased, burned, scattered, forgotten. At least, that was the plan.
In Scotland, families would sneak back to the execution grounds at night, collecting handfuls of ashes, whispering prayers over them. In France, some buried small stones where their loved ones had burned, carving secret crosses in the dirt. It was the only form of mourning they were allowed. But the fire had already spread, not just through the wood, but through the minds of men. Every burning fueled the next. Every scream was called proof of Satan's rage. Every ash-covered priest became more certain of his righteousness. Fear had become faith, and faith had become a weapon. The executions were not just punishments, they were performances, each one carefully staged to remind the crowd that God was watching. To question the flames was to question heaven itself. So the people bowed their heads and prayed, not realizing that prayer was now a chain. They said the fire would purify the wicked, but it was the innocent who burned, and the wicked were the ones who lit the match. For centuries, the witch fires burned across Europe, in marketplaces, fields, and hilltops. And when they finally died out, they left behind more than ashes. They left a stain on faith that no amount of prayer could ever wash clean. Even now, the earth remembers. In the soil where the fires once burned, nothing grows quite right. The air feels colder. And sometimes, when the wind passes through at night, people swear they can still hear the whispers of those who perished, their voices carried through time, warning us what happens when fear wears the mask of God. They called it justice. They called it faith. But history calls it what it was, a holocaust of innocence.
The fires had begun in small towns, a single execution here, a confession there. But soon those flames leapt across borders, carried not by wind, but by fear. Fear moved faster than any army. It traveled through sermons, through rumors, through ink on parchment.
And by the mid-1600s, that fear had wrapped itself around an entire continent. Europe, from Scotland to Italy, Germany to Poland, was ablaze, not with firewood, but with belief. The stories spread through pamphlets and sermons, tales of witches flying over villages, poisoning wells, cursing harvests. Each story was copied, embellished, exaggerated, and everywhere it went, people began to see witches everywhere. A farmer's bad crop, a child's fever, a cow's stillbirth. Each became proof of an invisible war between God and the devil. And the church stood at the center, the only supposed shield against the darkness it had itself unleashed. In France, preachers told villagers that Satan's army walked among them. In Scotland, pamphlets described witches feeding from the devil's breast. And in Germany, traveling priests held cleansing sermons, calling on people to report anyone suspicious. Fear became a form of worship. Every accusation was an offering to God. Every execution, a prayer of obedience. And the people believed, because to doubt the witch hunts was to doubt God himself. But fear has a way of feeding itself. Each town that burned witches inspired the next. Each inquisitor wanted to outdo the others, to burn more, to purify faster, to prove their devotion. The result was a continental-wide panic, a wildfire that needed no spark because belief itself was fuel. In Germany alone, tens of thousands were executed during the height of the hunts. Entire provinces, Bamberg, Würzburg, Trier, became graveyards. Letters from bishops spoke of the devil's plague spreading faster than they could contain it. In Switzerland, mountainside villages were emptied. In France, noble families lost daughters and wives. In Scotland, Parliament itself funded witch trials as acts of divine purification. Each new region repeated the same ritual, the same arrests, the same tortures, the same flames. And each time, the people believed they were doing something righteous. The sermons were the most powerful weapon. Priests stood before trembling congregations, warning that the devil was closer than ever. They spoke of the witches' covenant, of dark feasts in the woods, of women selling their souls for beauty or men for power. They preached that the only way to protect the innocent was to destroy the guilty, whoever they might be. It was holy terror disguised as salvation. Fear spread faster in times of hardship. When crops failed, people blamed witches. When disease struck, they blamed curses. When war came, they said Satan had sent his servants to weaken the faithful. And so every tragedy became a trial. Every death became evidence. Every rumor became truth.
The whispering began at night. One neighbor accused another. A jealous rival claimed to have seen someone speak to shadows. Soon, the whole village would gather in fear, pointing fingers, naming names, trying to purge the evil before it reached them. No one realized that the true evil was already there, inside the fear itself. In Poland, soldiers were sent to assist the inquisitors, turning small trials into mass purges. In Denmark, judges who hesitated were accused of witchcraft themselves. And in England, witchfinders like Matthew Hopkins built careers out of paranoia, roaming the countryside to hunt the devil's children. Wherever they went, they left smoke behind them. One German town in 1629 executed every woman over the age of 40. Another burned so many that the executioner ran out of rope. Records from Trier describe a year when the prisons were so full they had to build new gallows. And still the inquisitor said, "We are not cruel, we are faithful." But faith without reason had become a storm without end. Even children were not spared. In France and Switzerland, accused witches' children were interrogated and tortured to confirm their parents' guilt. Some confessed under fear. Some were executed alongside their families. Some simply vanished. By the late 1600s, whole generations had grown up believing witches were everywhere and that killing them was a holy duty. But not everyone believed. A few brave souls began to question the madness. Philosophers, scholars, even priests quietly wrote that torture could not reveal truth, that God would never ask for blood. Their words were whispered, hidden, smuggled from city to city, and though most were silenced, their doubts began to spread, slowly, quietly, like embers beneath the ash. Still, the flames did not stop. By the time skepticism reached the courts, tens of thousands were already dead. Villages wiped out, families erased, faith turned into fear, and fear into fuel. The witch hunts had become a machine of belief, one that devoured reason, mercy, and truth. They said the devil walked among them, but the devil didn't need to. He had already found a home in their hearts. Fear has always spread faster than fire, and in those dark centuries, it leapt from soul to soul, turning good men into executioners and faithful women into ashes. The whispering flames of Europe taught the world one lesson that still echoes today. When fear wears the face of righteousness, no one is safe, not even the righteous. They said the devil walked among them, but the devil didn't need to. He had already found a home in their hearts. The witch fires were not just about witches. They were about us, and how easily we burn what we do not understand.
The witch hunts were built on fear. But fear alone does not sustain a fire for centuries. It needs something else: profit. Behind every sermon, every trial, every burning stake, there were men who found a way to turn superstition into silver. They called themselves inquisitors, witchfinders, protectors of faith. But history remembers them for what they truly were: merchants of death. At first, the church had claimed the witch trials were acts of divine duty. But soon, the holy mission became a business model. Each accusation brought money. Each confession, a fee. Each execution, a profit. Families of the accused were charged for the wood, the rope, the chains, even for the priest's prayer. In some towns, the cost of a burning could bankrupt an entire household. Quote, "The devil takes her body," one record read, "and the church takes her home," unquote. The inquisitors were paid per conviction, not per investigation. The more witches they found, the richer they became. It was an economy of fear, a system that rewarded death. In Germany, inquisitors were given property seized from the condemned. In France, witchfinders were paid in gold for each guilty confession. In Scotland, local officials received bonuses from the church for each witch executed. The result? No shortage of witches, ever. Among the most notorious profiteers was Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed Witchfinder General of England. Between 1644 and 1647, Hopkins and his assistant, John Stern, terrorized eastern England, accusing, torturing, and executing over 300 people. They charged towns a fee per witch and billed extra for travel, lodging, and holy consultation.
When questioned about his methods, Hopkins replied, quote, "It is God's work, and God's work is not cheap," unquote. He died young, but not before making a fortune off the suffering of others.
Then there were the professional witch prickers of Scotland and Germany, men who carried retractable needles, claiming to find the devil's mark by stabbing victims' skin. For every mark they found, they were paid. Some pricked hundreds of bodies in a single month. Their hands were steady, their consciences empty. One of them confessed years later that his needle had a hidden spring. It could vanish into the handle so the accused wouldn't bleed. His victims? Dozens. His profit? Enough to retire a free man. But the church itself was no innocent bystander. Each trial meant tithes, fees, and confiscations. When someone was condemned, the church took their land, livestock, and gold. Even the ashes of the executed were sometimes sold as relics, proof of God's victory over evil. The witch hunts filled not just prisons, but treasuries. In Trier, local bishops amassed vast wealth from confiscated estates. In Bamberg, inquisitors lived in luxury while hundreds starved in dungeons below. And in Würzburg, one judge was known for drinking from a silver cup engraved with flames, a gift from a grateful archbishop for his purity of service. To them, the witch hunts were not horror. They were a career. The more the fear spread, the more money flowed. Fear became currency, and the witch hunters became its bankers. Even the common people joined in. Neighbors could settle debts by accusing each other. Merchants used witchcraft rumors to ruin competitors. Lords could seize land by accusing the poor of serving Satan. Justice had been replaced by greed in holy robes. What made the system unstoppable was that it fed itself. Every execution produced property to divide. Every confession created new suspects. Every new suspect required more trials, more fees, more priests. It was a self-perpetuating machine, fueled by superstition, powered by greed. And like all machines built on cruelty, it consumed the world around it until nothing was left. Even the language of the church became twisted by profit. Words like purification, redemption, and penance became code for extortion, theft, and death. The Inquisition had turned from a spiritual mission into an empire of gold. The devil no longer needed to tempt mankind. Men were doing his work willingly and getting paid for it. Some priests knew the truth and tried to stop it.
A few spoke out, saying, "If we profit from death, then we serve not God, but greed." Most of them disappeared soon after, their sermons erased, their names forgotten. Because in a world ruled by fear, truth was a dangerous currency, and no one dared to spend it. The witch hunter's greed had another consequence. It expanded the hunts beyond belief. Even when skepticism began to rise in universities and royal courts, the lower courts and clergy resisted, not because they believed, but because they profited. As long as fear brought gold, the fires would keep burning. They hunted witches, one historian wrote, but what they truly hunted was wealth. And when the gold finally ran out, when the towns were empty and the people too poor to pay for executions, only then did the hunts begin to fade. The witch hunters left behind no monuments, only records, scars,
and empty coffers. They vanished into history, their names swallowed by the very silence they sold. But their legacy remains, a warning carved into the bones of Europe. When fear becomes business, truth becomes worthless. The witch hunters were not servants of God. They were servants of greed, and they burned the innocent to feed it.
For centuries, the fires burned unchecked. From one corner of Europe to another, the same cries, the same flames, the same madness. But eventually, after oceans of blood and mountains of ash, a few brave voices began to whisper something forbidden. Not prayers, not accusations, but a single dangerous question. What if we are wrong? The first doubts came quietly from scholars and priests who had seen too much. They had watched innocent people die, watched confessions wrung from pain, watched children burned beside their mothers. And they began to suspect that the devil they hunted might live not in others, but in themselves. Their writings spread in secret, hidden in books, disguised as sermons, smuggled across borders in hollowed-out Bibles. Each word a spark, small, fragile, but bright enough to be seen through the smoke. One of the earliest and bravest was Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld, a German Jesuit priest. He had served as a confessor to condemned witches in Würzburg. He had heard their pleas, their pain, their final prayers before death, and what he saw broke him. In 1631, he published a book that changed everything, Cautio Criminalis, a warning to judges. It condemned the witch trials as a crime against faith and reason. Spee wrote, "I have seen the innocent die. I have heard their cries. If there are witches, God himself must weep for them." He published it anonymously. If the church had known it was him, he would have been burned like those he tried to save. Spee's words spread like whispers through Europe's universities and cathedrals. For the first time, educated men began to see the trials not as divine justice, but as mass hysteria. They began to ask the questions no one dared before. How could pain reveal truth? Why did every confession sound the same? Why did the devil always attack the poor and the powerless and never the rich? Each question was a stone thrown into a lake of silence, and the ripples began to reach the shore.
Others followed Spee's path. In Italy, a scholar named Giovanni Battista Porta published works on natural science, explaining that illnesses and storms were not curses but natural phenomena. In France, thinkers like Michel de Montaigne and later Voltaire began to challenge superstition through philosophy. They asked, if God is just, how could he delight in human cruelty? And across England, the first whispers of what would become the Age of Reason began to rise. Knowledge, not fear, was becoming the new form of faith. The printing press became the most powerful weapon against ignorance. For the first time, ideas traveled faster than inquisitors. Pamphlets denouncing witch hunts appeared across Europe, condemning torture, denouncing false confessions, and calling for rational law. The same machine that had once spread fear now began to spread light. By the late 1600s, some judges began refusing to allow torture. They demanded evidence, not stories, not marks, not dreams. And when no evidence could be found, the trials began to collapse under their own weight. In France, King Louis XIV issued decrees limiting witch trials. In Switzerland and Scotland, skeptical nobles began to intervene. And in Prussia, the philosopher Christian Thomasius, openly declared witchcraft to be a lie. His words were scandalous, but his courage saved lives. The last great witch trial in Germany took place in Quedlinburg in 1728. The accused woman, Maria Renata Sanger, was tortured, convicted, and executed. But the world that watched her burn was no longer the same. The people had begun to turn away from the flames. They no longer saw justice in fire. They saw only murder in the name of mercy. As reason spread, the witch hunters began to vanish. Their titles, once respected, became stains of shame. The church quietly distanced itself from the Inquisition, and the courts that had once demanded blood began to demand proof. It took centuries, but the light of logic finally began to pierce the long night of superstition. And yet, the cost of truth was written in ash. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 people, mostly women, were executed during the witch hunts. Each one a life cut short by fear disguised as faith. Each one a name erased, a story untold. The triumph of reason came too late for them. But without their suffering, the modern world might never have been born. They died believing the world had gone mad, and they were right. But from their ashes, reason rose, trembling, fragile, but alive. In the end, it was not one voice that ended the witch hunts. It was thousands. Priests who refused to lie, judges who refused to kill, scholars who refused to stay silent. Each of them lit a small candle in the darkness, and together those candles became dawn. The age of fire was ending. The age of understanding had begun. Truth does not roar, it whispers, and in time the world learns to listen.
The fires have long gone out. The smoke has lifted. The screams have faded into silence. But the shadows remain. Because history does not vanish when the flames die. It lingers in whispers, in fears, in the quiet corners of our hearts. And though centuries have passed since Europe's witch prisons crumbled, the echo of that madness still walks beside us. Where once stood the gallows and pyres, there are now villages, schools, and cathedrals. Children play in fields where ashes once fell. Tourists take photographs where the condemned once knelt. But beneath the soil, beneath the cobblestones, the earth remembers. Dig deep enough, and you'll still find fragments of bone, the last remains of lives consumed by fear disguised as faith. The witch hunts may have ended, but the ideas that birthed them did not die so easily. The need to fear, the hunger to blame, the belief that one's own virtue can justify cruelty, these things survived, and they still live within us today. Every time a society seeks an enemy to unite against, every time a voice is silenced because it challenges the majority, every time truth is sacrificed for comfort, a little piece of the witch fire burns again. In Europe, monuments now stand for the innocent dead. In Germany, the names of executed women are carved into stone. In Scotland, memorials whisper apologies centuries too late. And in Switzerland, bells ring once a year to mourn those who burned for nothing. But remembrance is not enough. Because the witch hunts were not just a tragedy of the past, they are a mirror of the present. Today, the word witch has changed. We no longer burn people in the square, but we still destroy lives with words, with lies, with judgment, with fear. In the age of the internet, accusers spread faster than ever, a modern kind of inquisition.
where the mob still demands a confession. The platforms are different, but the cruelty is the same.
Fear has always found new names for itself. It once called itself faith. Then it called itself patriotism. Now it calls itself truth. But underneath every disguise, it is still the same old fire, waiting for someone to light the match. The story of the witch hunts is not just history. It is a warning of what happens when belief becomes blind, when law becomes cruelty, and when ordinary people surrender conscience to the comfort of obedience. The men who burned witches believed they were righteous. That is what makes them terrifying, because righteousness without compassion is just another form of evil. But even in those dark centuries, there were lights that refused to go out. The few who spoke truth, the few who refused to accuse, the few who dared to see humanity in the condemned. They remind us that even in times of madness, courage can exist in silence. If history has one lesson, it is that darkness never disappears, it only waits. And if we forget what happened, it will return, not with fire and stake, but with fear and division. The witch hunts were never truly about witches. They were about us, about how easily we trade mercy for control and justice for power. The past is not past, wrote one historian. It sleeps beneath the surface, and sometimes it dreams of fire. So let us remember, let us speak their names, the names of those who were silenced by fear, because the moment we forget them, the flames will rise again, not from wood and tar, but from hearts that still have not learned. They called it the age of faith, but it was the age of fear. And yet, from the ashes, humanity learned to think, to question, to see.
The witch prisons are gone, the torturers are dust, but the truth remains. Every time we choose compassion over judgment, we undo a piece of that darkness. And every time we fail to, it returns. The fires are gone, but the shadows are still with us. Remember them, so they never return. The fires of Europe were dying down. The courts had grown quiet. The screams were fading from the dungeons. But fear, that ancient, restless spirit, refused to die. It crossed the ocean, hidden not in smoke or ash, but in the hearts of those who carried it. And when the first ships from England, France, and Germany reached the shores of the New World, they brought with them more than faith, more than dreams, more than hope. They brought the ghosts of the witch hunts. The settlers who built the colonies of North America carried European memory in their bones. They remembered famine, plague, and holy fear. They remembered sermons that spoke of Satan's presence in every forest and whisper. And when they landed in a land vast and wild, a place where shadows seemed to move between the trees, those old fears began to grow again. Here, the devil was not just imagined, he was expected. The Puritans who settled in New England believed they were founding a city upon a hill, a new Eden, pure and obedient to God. But their faith came with chains. Every drought, every illness, every stillborn child became a sign that God's enemy was near. And so, just as Europe had once turned inward to find witches among its people, so too did the New World begin its own hunt.
By the 1660s, whispers of witchcraft had already begun in the colonies. In Connecticut, a woman named Alice Young was hanged for witchcraft in 1647, the first recorded execution in America. Her crime? That her neighbor's children had fallen sick. The witch fires of Europe had finally found new kindling. Life in the New World was harsh. Crops failed. Winters were deadly. Native tribes fought to reclaim their land. Every fear needed a name, and witch was the name they knew best. So the colonists built their faith on the edge of wilderness, surrounded by what they believed was Satan's kingdom. To them, the devil lived in the forests, in the dark places between the trees, and sometimes in their neighbors' eyes. In Massachusetts, Puritan ministers began to warn their flocks. The devil works in the hearts of the weak. He tempts the poor, the widowed, the disobedient. They spoke of invisible armies, of spirits that flew through the night, of women who cursed livestock and whispered to unseen things. They told their people that vigilance was godliness and suspicion was safety. And once again, as in Europe, the sermons became sparks. By the 1680s, accusations spread across the colonies. In towns like Springfield, Hartford, and Andover, women were charged with consorting with the devil. They were interrogated by ministers, examined for devil's marks, and imprisoned in cold wooden jails that echoed the witch prisons of Europe. The old rituals had crossed the sea perfectly intact, reborn in the hands of a new world that believed it had escaped the old one. But nowhere would this fear burn brighter than in a small farming community just north of Boston, a town called Salem Village. It was there, in the winter of 1692, that whispers turned into hysteria, and hysteria turned into history. In the parsonage of Reverend Samuel Parris, two young girls, his daughter Betty and his niece Abigail Williams, began to scream. They convulsed, spoke in strange voices, and claimed to see visions of black dogs and shadowy women. Doctors could find no cause, and so, as always, the blame turned to the supernatural. The devil, they said, had come to Salem.
It began with 3 names. Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados who lived in Paris's home. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a sickly widow who had skipped church for weeks. They were accused of witchcraft by the frightened children, and the entire village believed. What began as a whisper in one house soon became a storm that consumed a colony. Tituba, beaten and terrified, confessed under pressure. But her confession was not one of guilt. It was a reflection of her captor's fears. She spoke of dark figures, flying spirits, and witches meeting with the devil. Her words matched the stories the Puritans already believed. And so the confession became proof. More names were demanded, and more accusations followed. Within weeks, dozens were arrested. Within months, hundreds were accused. The trials of Salem had begun, and once again, the devil's shadow stretched across the world of men. But this time, the smoke would not rise from Europe's old stones. It would rise from American soil. The fear that had traveled across oceans now had a new home, a new language, a new audience. And though the faces of the judges and the prisoners had changed, the story remained the same. Faith twisted into fury, law
twisted into violence, humanity lost in the flames. The devil, one preacher declared, has found fertile ground in the new world. And he was right. But the devil was not hiding in the forests or in the women they hanged. He was standing in the pulpits and sitting in the judge's chair. The story of the witch hunts had crossed the sea, reborn in the soil of the Americas, and soon it would burn again. This time not in dungeons or castles, but in the open fields of a new land that promised freedom and delivered fire.
Winter, 1692. The fields of Salem lay under snow. The nights were long and silent. But beneath that silence, something was waking, something older than reason, hungrier than faith. It began with children's screams, and it would end with the hangman's rope. Inside the small Puritan village of Salem, the minister's house was no longer a home. Reverend Samuel Parris's daughter, Betty, and niece, Abigail Williams, had become the center of something inexplicable. They convulsed, shrieked, and fell to the floor as if invisible hands were seizing them. Doctors found no illness, and so the only explanation left was witchcraft. When the Reverend demanded names, the girls spoke, and their whispers ignited a wildfire. They named Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados who told stories of spirits and magic. They named Sarah Good, a poor beggar who muttered to herself in the streets. And they named Sarah Osborne, a widow who had dared to miss church. 3 women, 3 outsiders, 3 perfect scapegoats. By dawn, they were in chains. The examinations were held in the Salem meeting house, where the villagers gathered to watch. The air was thick with incense and fear. Every question was a trap, every word a weapon. When Tituba was brought before the crowd, trembling, she confessed. But it was not truth she confessed to, it was survival. Under pressure, she told the story the Puritans already believed, that she had seen black dogs, red cats, and tall men in dark cloaks, that witches flew through the night to serve the devil. Her confession was pure invention, a reflection of the fears of those around her. But to Salem, it was proof. And with that, the hysteria was born.
Within weeks, dozens of villagers were accused. By spring, the jails were full. Farmers, midwives, servants, even respected church members found themselves behind bars, accused by their own neighbors. The court believed the devil's presence could be proven through spectral evidence. The claim that a witch's spirit could appear in dreams or visions. If someone said they saw your ghost tormenting them, that was enough to hang you. It was faith turned against logic, and no one was safe. The most powerful men in Massachusetts, judges, ministers, and magistrates, gathered to create a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Its purpose was simple: to hear accusations, to take confessions, and to execute. Justice had been replaced by performance. Trials became theater, and the crowd came to watch. One of the first to stand trial was Bridget Bishop, a lively woman who wore bright clothes and spoke her mind, both sins in the eyes of Puritans. Witnesses claimed her spirit pinched and choked them in their sleep. Others said she bewitched their livestock. She denied it all. But denial in Salem was the same as guilt. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill, the first of 19 souls executed for witchcraft. The hangings continued throughout the summer. Sarah Good followed, clutching her newborn child. When the Reverend urged her to repent, she spat the final words of her life.
You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. The rope snapped. The crowd cheered, and the smoke of righteous death rose once again. By August, the trials consumed the colony. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother known for her kindness, was convicted despite protests of her innocence. Her last words, "God knows I am not guilty." Martha Carrier, accused by her own children, was called the Queen of Hell. When asked to confess, she replied, "I would rather die as I am than live as you are." She too swung from the gallows. The prisons overflowed. Men and women were chained to the floor, starving, shivering, waiting for their turn to die. Some confessed to impossible things, to flying through the night, to speaking with the devil, because it was the only way to stop the torture. The judges took these lies as truth. The cycle of madness fed itself. But not everyone was silent. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most respected theologians of the time, began to question the trials. He warned, "It is better that 10 witches escape than that one innocent person be condemned." His son, Cotton Mather, disagreed, believing the trials were holy work. Father and son became symbols of the war between reason and blind faith. And in Salem, faith was still winning. Then came the case that broke Salem's soul. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. He refused to plead guilty or innocent, knowing either answer would cost him his life. So the court used an ancient punishment, pressing.
He was stripped, laid on the ground, and heavy stones were placed on his chest until he could no longer breathe. When asked for his confession, he did not cry for mercy. He said only 2 words, "More weight." And with that defiance, he died, a martyr crushed beneath the weight of his own courage. By autumn, the colony was broken. Crops rotted in the fields. Trade stopped. Even children were accused. The people of Salem began to realize that the devil they hunted had never been in their neighbors. He had been in their fear all along. In October 1692, Governor Phipps, horrified by the chaos, ordered the court of Oyer and Terminer dissolved. The hangings stopped. The jails slowly emptied, but the damage was done. 19 people had been executed. 5 more had died in prison, and 1 had been crushed to death. All in less than a year. Years later, the colony would issue formal apologies. Judges confessed regret. Survivors were paid in silver, a poor price for stolen lives. And yet, Salem's name would forever be carved into history as a monument to the danger of fear wearing faith's disguise. They sought the devil in the eyes of their neighbors and found him staring back in their own reflection. The witch trials of Salem were not born from evil. They were born from fear. The same fear that had crossed the ocean. The same fear that once filled Europe's dungeons and squares. And though the flames had cooled, the ashes still glowed. In the year of our Lord 1692, faith devoured truth, and fear ruled the hearts of men.
For centuries, Europe had lived in the shadow of fear. The Inquisition's dungeons had swallowed tens of thousands. The witch hunters had ruled through confession and fire. And for a long time, no one dared question them. But as the world turned into a new century, as the 1600s gave way to the 1700s, the world began to change. The church still preached about demons and witches, but in secret halls and candlelit studies, a new kind of faith was being born, the faith of reason. Europe was beginning to think. In cities like London, Paris, Berlin, and Amsterdam, scientists, philosophers, and reformers were asking forbidden questions. Why does thunder strike? Why does sickness spread? What causes madness? And every answer they found chipped away at the superstition that had ruled for generations. The devil, they realized, was not hiding in storms or plagues. He was hiding in ignorance. The printing press had changed everything. Knowledge could now travel faster than fear. Books once hidden behind monastery walls spread across Europe. The works of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton turned mystery into mathematics, and faith began to lose its monopoly on truth. For the first time, the idea of the supernatural was being replaced by science, and with it, the foundation of witch hunting began to crack. In the early 1700s, kings and scholars began to speak out. In Prussia, Christian Thomasius, a philosopher and jurist, openly mocked the witch trials, calling them madness disguised as justice. He argued that no one should die for invisible crimes. In France, the philosopher Voltaire declared, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." And in Austria, Empress Maria Theresa ordered that every accusation of witchcraft must first be reviewed by scholars, not priests. The change was slow, but it had begun.
Even within the church, cracks were forming. Priests and monks who had once carried out the Inquisition's orders began to question whether their holy mission had ever truly served God. Some whispered that the Inquisition had become a machine of power, driven not by faith, but by politics and fear. And as new generations rose, the old zeal began to die. By the mid-1700s, many European courts no longer accepted witchcraft as a crime. In Sweden, the last known witch was executed in 1704. In Germany, the last trial took place in 1775, when a woman named Anna Goldie was accused of cursing a child. She was tortured, confessed, and executed, the final victim of Europe's witch hysteria. In 2008, over 2 centuries later, the Swiss government officially cleared her name. The once feared Inquisition, too, began to crumble. It had long been a shadow empire within the church, judging, torturing, and executing in the name of purity. But with the rise of Enlightenment thinkers, its secrets were dragged into the light. Writers exposed the cruelty of its prisons. Philosophers questioned its divine authority, and kings began to see it not as holy justice, but as a rival power. In 1772, the Portuguese Inquisition was officially dismantled. Spain's would linger a bit longer, but even there, the fires grew cold. By the 1834, the Spanish Inquisition, the most feared institution in Christendom, was finally abolished. The Age of Fire had ended, and all that remained were ashes and shame.
But the victory of reason did not come without a cost. For every law repealed, for every prison emptied, there were thousands whose names would never be known. They had been erased, their graves unmarked, their stories forgotten. The end of the Inquisition did not bring them justice, but it brought meaning to their suffering. Their deaths had forced the world to see what it had become. As the 18th century dawned, Europe began to redefine itself. The word witch faded from legal texts. The word heretic began to disappear. And in their place came new words: citizen, scholar, human. The Enlightenment was more than philosophy.
It was the rediscovery of conscience, the idea that belief could not justify cruelty and the truth could not be tortured from the innocent. In the cities that had once held witch prisons, universities rose. In the halls that once echoed with screams, students debated science and philosophy. The same buildings that had been tools of fear became temples of knowledge. It was as if Europe itself had woken from a nightmare and was trying to remember who it was before the darkness fell. The Inquisition, wrote one historian, was not destroyed by rebellion, but by reflection. When the world learned to question, when it dared to think, the witch hunters lost their power.
No sword defeated them. No army overthrew them. They were undone by an idea, and that idea was reason. The end of the Inquisition marked more than the end of an era. It marked the rebirth of the human mind. From the ruins of fear rose curiosity. From the silence of the condemned rose the voice of science. And from the ashes of the witch hunters rose the Enlightenment, the dawn after the longest night. They once burned the wise for their words. Now the world listens to them. The age of torture had ended. The age of thought had begun. The fires had gone out. The gallows stood empty. And Europe, after centuries of fear, finally opened its eyes. For the first time, men and women looked at the world not through the lens of superstition, but through the lens of curiosity. The age of darkness was ending, and in its place rose something extraordinary, an age of light, an age of reason, an age called the Enlightenment. For centuries, questions had been punishable by death, but now questions became the heartbeat of civilization. What once was whispered in secret rooms was now printed and shared across continents. And everywhere, thinkers emerged, armed not with swords, but with ideas. In France, Voltaire challenged blind faith and fanaticism. In England, Isaac Newton turned the heavens from mystery into mathematics. In Scotland, David Hume examined the nature of belief itself. And in Prussia, Immanuel Kant declared, "Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding." That single phrase became the anthem of an entire era.
In medicine, doctors began to see what the witch hunters could not. Diseases were not curses. Seizures were not signs of possession. Mental illness was not evidence of the devil, but a condition of the mind and body. For the first time, compassion entered where cruelty once ruled. Patients were treated, not tortured, and healing replaced exorcism. The witch's mark, once believed to be the devil's seal, was recognized as a birthmark, a scar, a freckle. Science began to unmask superstition, and every discovery brought humanity closer to truth. In the halls of universities, the idea of skepticism took root. To doubt was no longer sinful, it was noble. To question the world was to understand it. Philosophers wrote of liberty, equality, and the rights of man. Artists painted not saints and demons, but people, ordinary, flawed, beautiful people. And slowly the grip of the old fear began to weaken. The Enlightenment was not a single movement, it was a collective awakening. A moment in history when humanity remembered it could think for itself. No longer did the heavens move by divine mystery. They moved by gravity. No longer were eclipses omens, they were orbits. No longer were the sick condemned, they were understood. The language of the universe changed, and humanity learned to read it.
In the coffee houses of London and Paris,
Philosophers debated morality, science, and freedom. Ordinary citizens gathered to discuss books banned only a generation before. And in these smoky, crowded rooms, the seeds of democracy were sown. Knowledge, once a privilege of priests and kings, became the right of every human being. The world was learning that ignorance, not evil, was the true enemy. It was during this time that the last witch hunters died, and with them died the notion that fear could purify faith. Where once stood the Inquisition's dungeons, there now rose schools and libraries. Where once women had been burned as witches, they now began to write, to teach, and to think freely. Voices long silenced were finding strength again. The same hands that had once bound illegally were now building telescopes, printing books, and reaching toward the stars. The Enlightenment gave birth to more than science. It gave birth to empathy, the realization that cruelty, no matter its justification, was still cruelty. And slowly, nations began to reform their laws. Torture was abolished. Public executions declined. Prisons became regulated. And the word justice began to mean something more than punishment. It began to mean humanity. For centuries, the world had been ruled by fear of the unseen. Now, it was driven by a hunger for understanding. The stars that once inspired terror became objects of study. The diseases that once inspired witch hunts became puzzles to solve. And the minds that once hid in fear became the architects of a new world. A world built not on superstition, but on knowledge.
But enlightenment did not erase the past. It did not bring back the lives lost or heal the wounds burned into memory. What it offered was something quieter, a promise that humanity could learn, that truth once found could replace fear, that reason once awakened could never again be silenced. Those who do not remember the past, wrote philosopher Georges Santayana centuries later, are condemned to repeat it. The witch prisons of Europe had fallen. The Inquisition was gone, but their ghosts lived on, as reminders of what happens when belief forgets compassion. And so the Enlightenment was not just an era of discovery. It was an act of redemption. The world had come far, from the dungeons of darkness to the dawn of understanding. And yet, the story was not over, because the legacy of fear still lingered in humanity's heart, waiting, always, for a chance to return. The fires are gone, the prisons stand empty, and the world, the same world that once burned its own, has grown quiet again. The long night has ended, but the shadows it left behind still whisper. In the stone ruins of old Europe, in fields where the earth is black with ash, if you listen closely, you can still hear them. The prayers, the screams, the silence that followed. Centuries have passed since the last witch was executed. The world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have fallen. Nations have risen. Science has conquered mystery. But the memory of those who died in the name of fear still lingers, like smoke that never fully clears. They were mothers and daughters, healers and widows, midwives, scholars, wanderers, ordinary souls caught in the machinery of belief. They were branded as monsters,
simply because they were misunderstood. In towns across Europe, memorials now stand where gallows once cast their shadows. In Germany, plaques bear the names of those condemned without proof. In Scotland, stone circles have been raised to honor the thousands lost. And in Switzerland, bells toll each year to mourn the last witch executed on their soil. History at last has begun to whisper apologies, centuries too late, but better than silence. The witch hunts were never about witches. They were about control, about fear dressed as virtue, about a society that could not accept what it did not understand. And so, the lessons of that dark age remain as warnings for our own, because every age invents its own witch hunts. The forms change, the fear remains. When a society decides who is other, when it condemns before it listens, the fires begin to glow again. Centuries have passed since the last witch was executed. The world has changed beyond recognition. Empires have fallen. Nations have risen. Science has conquered mystery. But the memory of those who died in the name of fear still lingers, like smoke that never fully clears. They were mothers and daughters, healers and widows, midwives, scholars, wanderers, ordinary souls caught in the machinery of belief. They were branded as monsters, simply because they were misunderstood. In towns across Europe, memorials now stand where gallows once cast their shadows. In Germany, plaques bear the names of those condemned without proof. In Scotland, stone circles have been raised to honor the thousands lost. And in Switzerland, bells toll each year to mourn the last witch executed on their soil. History at last has begun to whisper apologies, centuries too late, but better than silence. The witch hunts were never about witches. They were about control, about fear dressed as virtue, about a society that could not accept what it did not understand. And so, the lessons of that dark age remain as warnings for our own, because every age invents its own witch hunts. The forms change, the fear remains. When a society decides who is other, when it condemns before it listens, the fires begin to glow again.
Even today, we see the same patterns, the same fear of difference, the same rush to judgment, the same hunger to destroy what we do not understand. We no longer build gallows in the town square, but we build them with words, with rumors, with lies that spread faster than truth. And though the flames are gone, the ashes of intolerance still drift through our world. Yet, for all that was lost, something beautiful survived. The courage of those who refused to confess, the strength of those who met their death with dignity, the compassion of those who dared to speak reason in an age that punished thinking. Their lives, their suffering, became the foundation of our humanity. Because of them, we learned that justice cannot exist without mercy, that belief means nothing without empathy, and that truth cannot be born from pain. The Enlightenment turned the page. The prisons were emptied.
The fires cooled, but the memory of the witch hunts became a scar, a mark, to remind us of what humanity is capable of when fear triumphs over compassion. From that scar, the world grew wiser, and though the healing took centuries, the wound became a lesson written in blood and smoke. Never again.
Today, where those prisons once stood, there are gardens and schools. Where those victims were hanged, there are markets and churches. And where the flames once rose into the night, there is sunlight, warm, golden, forgiving. The world kept turning, the voices of the lost became part of its wind, and every whisper of history reminds us the darkness will return if we let it. We must remember, wrote one historian, not because we love tragedy, but because forgetting is how it begins again. Remember them. Remember the ones who were silenced, the ones who were called witches, heretics, monsters, and yet were only human. Their deaths were not the end of their story. Their courage, quiet, invisible, eternal, is what ended the night. The witch prisons of Europe are silent now. The Inquisition's chains have rusted away, but their ghosts live on, not to haunt, but to remind. Each time we choose knowledge over ignorance, each time we speak for the voiceless, each time we question cruelty, we carry their memory forward. That is how the long night truly ends, not with sunrise, but with remembrance. The night is long, says an old proverb, but dawn always comes. For those who were lost, for those who were silenced, for those who burned, the dawn is here. Their voices rise not in screams, but in stories, in truth, in history remembered. And so ends our journey, from the dungeons of faith to the dawn of reason, from fire to understanding. The story of the witch prisons is not just the story of death, it is the story of rebirth. The long night has ended, and at last, the world remembers.